The shocking differences between Catherine, the Princess of Wales, and Meghan Markle have just been exposed in glorious.
For years, the palace dismissed the tension as gossip, misunderstanding, and family discomfort. But behind closed doors, Catherine had allegedly issued a warning so serious that senior courtiers documented it in secret, and when Meghan's latest move revived those fears, the buried message could no longer remain hidden. Meghan's newest public reinvention had been presented as another fresh beginning, another carefully controlled attempt to move beyond the bitterness of royal life. Yet inside palace circles, it reportedly caused something far more unsettling. Old concerns returned. Former aides began revisiting conversations from the years when Meghan was still working within the monarchy, when every smile concealed strain and every private exchange seemed to carry consequences far beyond the room. The issue had never been as simple as two women failing to connect. This was not merely Catherine's reserved nature clashing with Meghan's confidence. At the heart of the tension was trust. Who could be allowed into private conversations? Which emotional moments were truly safe? And what would happen if personal disagreements, spoken in confidence, later became part of a public story? According to the account that would eventually emerge, Catherine had raised those questions after a sequence of private incidents left her deeply uneasy. She did not accuse Meghan openly. She did not demand punishment or exclusion. Instead, she watched. She followed protocol. She kept her voice controlled and attempted to protect the fragile bond between William and Harry, even as that bond began to strain under the pressure. But Catherine faced a painful choice. If she spoke too strongly, she risked appearing hostile toward Harry's new wife. She could be painted as jealous, cold, or unwilling to welcome change. If she remained silent, however, the danger might grow until the palace could no longer contain it. Senior courtiers allegedly noticed the shift before anyone discussed it directly. Catherine became more careful during meetings. She offered fewer personal details at family gatherings. When Meghan entered sensitive conversations, Catherine reportedly measured every word, aware that even an innocent remark might later be remembered differently. To Meghan, that restraint may have felt like rejection. Catherine's caution could easily be read as distance, superiority, or rivalry. But from Catherine's perspective, silence was not cruelty. It was protection against a situation she no longer believed was predictable. The palace's greatest fear was not a public argument. It was something slower and more destructive, trust disappearing behind closed doors while everyone continued smiling in public. Every conversation became dangerous because no one knew where it might eventually travel. Then came one private incident that allegedly changed Catherine's view completely. After that moment, she no longer saw the tension as temporary family discomfort. She began to fear that the same pattern could one day threaten the monarchy's control over its own story. The warning she issued was never intended to leave a tiny royal circle. But someone kept the original record. And to understand why Catherine felt compelled to issue such a warning, the story must return to the moment when royal politeness first gave way to private suspicion. The public saw two royal women standing side by side, smiling beneath palace lights. But behind those carefully controlled appearances, Catherine was allegedly noticing something far more troubling. Private conversations repeated elsewhere, emotional moments reinterpreted, and innocent exchanges quietly transformed into weapons of perception. In the beginning, Catherine had reportedly tried to approach Meghan with patience. She understood better than most how cruel royal life could become. For years, Catherine had been criticized, compared, photographed, and judged before finally gaining a sense of security within the institution. She knew the pressure could feel lonely, and she understood that palace rules were rarely explained with warmth. But Catherine also believed trust inside the royal family could not be rushed. It was earned slowly, through restraint, loyalty, and the quiet protection of private moments. She did not offer instant intimacy. She offered time. Meghan, however, allegedly viewed that caution very differently. She believed the palace was withholding guidance while expecting her to master traditions she had barely been taught. She saw Catherine occupying a protected position, surrounded by advisors and defended by a system that seemed far less patient with Harry's new wife. Then small details began resurfacing. A phrase from a private exchange appeared in a media narrative. An emotional disagreement was repeated through outside voices. Carefully worded public remarks seemed to echo conversations that had taken place behind palace doors. None of these moments was dramatic enough to justify an open confrontation. Each could be dismissed as coincidence, misunderstanding, or gossip, but together they formed a pattern Catherine could no longer ignore. She reportedly began to fear that Meghan was not simply reacting to royal pressure in the moment. She was remembering every slight, collecting every grievance, and placing each disagreement into a larger story about rejection, isolation, and unfair treatment. The contrast between the two women became sharper. Catherine trusted silence, patience, and slow influence. Meghan wanted immediate answers, emotional recognition, and visible change. What one viewed as discipline, the other experienced as coldness. William noticed the effect on Catherine. He became increasingly protective, especially as the tension began reaching beyond the two women and damaging his relationship with Harry. Harry, meanwhile, believed Meghan was being judged by impossible standards. To him, Catherine's caution looked less like protection and more like the palace closing ranks. Then came the moment that deepened Catherine's suspicions. An emotional family discussion was allegedly repeated outside its original setting, stripped of its full context, but close enough to the private exchange to alarm senior royals. Still, Catherine resisted putting anything in writing. She knew documents could survive for decades. One warning could reshape reputations long after the emotions behind it had faded. But palace officials eventually forced the question she had been avoiding. Could this situation still be contained without formal boundaries? Catherine's answer would change everything, because it transformed private discomfort into an institutional concern that the palace could no longer pretend not to see. No announcement was made. No official minutes were released. Meghan and Harry were not invited. Yet inside a guarded palace room, Catherine allegedly sat opposite senior advisors and answered a question that carried enormous consequences. Did she still believe the Sussex situation could be repaired? By then, the relationship between the two royal households had become dangerously fragile. William and Harry were speaking with growing tension. Catherine had become more guarded. Meghan felt increasingly isolated. Every private exchange carried the weight of an argument that had not yet fully exploded. The gathering was deliberately small. Catherine and William were joined by a senior private secretary, a communications advisor, and one trusted representative connected to the monarch. This was not presented as a trial, nor was it officially designed to punish Meghan. The purpose was colder and more serious, to decide whether the palace needed stronger protection around confidential family discussions, staff relationships, and future royal planning. Catherine reportedly entered the meeting reluctantly. She understood that anything she said could later be portrayed as an attempt to influence Harry and Meghan's place inside the monarchy. So she began carefully, separating personal discomfort from institutional danger. She did not say Meghan was incapable of royal duty. She questioned whether Meghan accepted the limits that royal duty demanded. According to Catherine's alleged assessment, Meghan viewed boundaries as proof of rejection. The monarchy viewed those same boundaries as essential to survival. That difference was becoming impossible to manage. Catherine feared that every disagreement might one day be retold through friends, interviews, documentaries, books, or carefully controlled public statements. A private emotional moment could be stripped of context. A frustrated sentence could become evidence. A family argument could become part of a global narrative. William supported Catherine's concerns, but he urged the advisers not to create anything that could appear to be a plan to remove Harry and Meghan. He knew Harry would see such a document as confirmation that the palace had turned against his wife. The advisers faced an impossible choice. Ignoring the warning could leave the institution exposed. Acting on it could deepen the very distrust they were trying to contain. Then came the phrase that would later define the entire controversy. The family must assume that private words may not remain private. Catherine allegedly requested a clearer separation between family conversations and official business. She wanted vulnerable relatives, household staff, and future plans protected from emotional exchanges that might later be presented without full context. But one question divided the room. Should Meghan be told? Some argued that transparency was the only fair approach. Others warned that Meghan would see new restrictions as proof of a hidden campaign against her. In the end, the document was softened. Names disappeared. Direct concerns became general procedure. What began as Catherine's warning was transformed into a neutral palace recommendation. But the first draft was not destroyed. Someone preserved the stronger version, and its language was far more explosive than the palace ever intended the public to know. That earlier draft held the truth the palace had spent years concealing, and when its central warning finally emerged, Meghan's entire version of the royal conflict faced a devastating new challenge. The warning was not a jealous complaint, nor a demand that Meghan be removed. It was colder, more precise, and far more damaging. Catherine allegedly warned that unless firm boundaries were imposed, private pain would one day be converted into public power and the family would lose control of its own story. At the heart of the document was a fear the palace had avoided naming. Catherine allegedly believed Meghan was beginning to treat private royal experiences not simply as family matters to be resolved, but as evidence within a much larger story. Every slight could become a chapter. Every disagreement could become proof. Every silence could later be presented as cruelty. That was what made the warning so serious. Catherine reportedly understood Meghan's emotional intelligence and instinct for public communication. She feared those strengths could turn the palace's traditional silence into a weapon against itself. If Meghan ever spoke openly, the monarchy's refusal to respond would not protect the family. It would leave her account standing alone, powerful and almost impossible to challenge. The warning was strategic, not personal. Catherine did not claim Meghan had already planned a betrayal. She argued that the conditions for one were already forming. She allegedly predicted three outcomes. Private conversations would eventually reach the public. Harry would become increasingly separated from William, and every attempt by the palace to defend itself would be framed as retaliation against Meghan. Those predictions were devastating because they appeared to resemble what later unfolded after the Sussex departure. Catherine urged the palace to avoid emotional confrontations without witnesses. Major decisions, she argued, should be communicated formally. Access to certain internal discussions should be limited. Staff members who feared becoming part of a public battle needed greater protection. But the most painful part concerned Harry. Catherine reportedly believed his loyalty to Meghan would eventually become so absolute that he would reject any evidence that challenged her interpretation of events. To Catherine, that possibility carried deep personal guilt. Harry had once felt like a younger brother. Warning the palace about his wife could look like betrayal, even if she believed she was protecting him. Had Meghan seen the original document, she would almost certainly have viewed it differently. To her, it might have proved that Catherine was influencing palace decisions privately while appearing calm and neutral in public. The warning is allegedly emerging now because a former palace figure preserved the preliminary draft, convinced that history would one day need to know what had been anticipated. Meghan's latest public controversy with old grievances and private relationships once again entering discussion, reportedly forced that record back into view. Former courtiers remain divided. Some see Catherine as perceptive. Others believe the warning created the very distrust it predicted. But the greatest shock was still hidden. The document did not remain advice on paper. It influenced a palace decision Meghan discovered only after it had already been made. And when Meghan finally realized that invisible boundaries had been placed around her, her response did not calm the crisis. It pushed Harry toward the most consequential choice of his royal life. Meghan was never shown Catherine's warning, but she allegedly began to feel its effects everywhere. Meetings became more formal. Invitations changed. Staff chose their words carefully. Doors that once opened through family trust now required palace approval, and Meghan quickly realized someone had decided she was a risk. There was no formal accusation, no document placed before her, and no official explanation. Instead, the change appeared through small details. Conversations ended sooner than before. Written summaries followed sensitive meetings. Decisions involving family participation were discussed elsewhere, then presented to Meghan only after the important choices had already been made. At first, she blamed the courtiers. To Meghan, they represented an old system determined to protect tradition from anyone bold enough to challenge it. She believed they were using protocol not as guidance, but as control. Then, one decision changed her suspicions. A family arrangement involving access, timing, and participation was altered in a way that seemed to reflect concerns Catherine had once raised privately. Meghan allegedly began to wonder whether the restrictions were coming from higher inside the family. She told Harry that William and Catherine might not simply be cautious. They might be shaping an internal campaign against them. Harry's reaction was immediate and deeply emotional. His anger was not limited to the present dispute. It carried years of resentment toward the press, the institution, and those he believed had failed to protect his mother. If the same system was now closing around Meghan, he would not remain silent. This was the cruel irony of Catherine's warning. Every boundary created to protect the palace looked to Meghan and Harry like further proof that the palace feared her. Every careful procedure felt like punishment. Every silence seemed to confirm an accusation no one would openly make. Meghan reportedly asked for a direct conversation. She wanted to know who had changed the rules and why, but advisors urged everyone to wait until emotions settled. That delay became a devastating mistake. To the palace, it was containment. To Meghan, it was confirmation that decisions were being made behind her back. She began holding tightly to her own memory of events, fearing that the institution would eventually rewrite the story and leave her with no voice. Harry now faced an impossible choice. Trusting William meant questioning Meghan's instincts. Trusting Meghan meant accepting that his own family had acted against them. During one private exchange, William allegedly warned that personal grievances could create permanent damage to the monarchy. Harry did not hear concern. He heard control. Catherine remained silent, convinced that defending herself would only deepen the conflict. Yet Meghan saw another contradiction. The palace demanded silence from her, while unnamed insiders continued shaping public opinion through leaks and selective briefings. Both sides believed they were defending themselves. In reality, every defensive move made reconciliation less likely. And in private, Harry and Meghan began considering the unthinkable. If they could not control their roles inside the monarchy, they would build a life beyond it. But leaving the palace would not free them from Catherine's warning. It would create the exact conditions in which that warning could become impossible to ignore. When Harry and Meghan stepped away, they believed distance would finally give them freedom, dignity, and control. Instead, the royal separation created a global battlefield of competing memories, and with every interview and revelation, Catherine's hidden warning appeared less like suspicion and more like prophecy. The departure was more than a change of residence or duty. It was the emotional breaking point that turned a private family conflict into an international struggle over truth, loyalty, and reputation. Until then, the palace had controlled the structure of royal life. Now, Harry and Meghan possessed something the institution could not contain: the freedom to speak in their own language, on their own platforms, before a global audience. The monarchy responded as it always had: brief statements, carefully chosen phrases, long silences. But that silence carried a terrible risk. Catherine had allegedly warned that if Meghan ever spoke publicly, the absence of an immediate royal response would allow her account to dominate. And that was exactly what began to happen. Private conversations entered public discussion. Emotional disputes became evidence. Security fears, family tensions, and moments once buried behind palace doors were suddenly debated across the world. Every revelation widened the distance between the Sussexes and the family they had left behind. Catherine remained restrained, even when her motives and behavior became part of the story. She did not publicly answer every claim. She did not explain every private decision. Yet the cost of that silence was deeply personal. She had to maintain control while strangers judged relationships, intentions, and moments she believed should never have left the family. Meghan saw the matter differently. She believed public disclosure had become necessary because private palace systems had failed to hear her, protect her, or acknowledge the harm she felt. Harry's disclosures became both an act of loyalty toward his wife and a rebellion against years of royal silence. With each interview, however, the positions hardened. The Sussexes believed honesty exposed institutional cruelty. Palace loyalists believed the same disclosures proved the original concerns about trust. Public sympathy split into opposing camps, and every gesture, statement, or absence was treated as fresh evidence. William became increasingly unwilling to speak privately with Harry. The fear was simple and devastating. Any conversation might later become public. Catherine's warning, created to prevent total collapse, had now become part of the reason reconciliation seemed impossible. Senior advisors allegedly kept the document hidden to protect Catherine from accusations that she had engineered the Sussex departure. But its emergence now threatens to reshape the entire story. Was Catherine unfairly suspicious from the beginning, or was she the first to recognize what was coming? That question returned with new force when Meghan's latest move reportedly touched the one thing Catherine had always fought hardest to protect: her family's private emotional world. And this time, the conflict would not remain focused on old interviews or vanished palace meetings, because Meghan's newest step allegedly crossed a boundary Catherine considered absolutely unforgivable. The palace had endured interviews, memoirs, accusations, and years of silence. But Meghan's latest move allegedly revived a detail connected directly to Catherine's private family life, and suddenly, the warning buried years earlier was no longer history. It had become an urgent defense against a new threat. The spark was not an open attack. Meghan did not directly accuse Catherine or reveal one explosive secret. Instead, a new project and carefully chosen public remarks reportedly returned to familiar themes: isolation, family pressure, private suffering, and the cost of remaining silent inside a powerful institution. To the wider public, the language sounded personal but general. To former palace officials, it felt dangerously specific. Certain phrases appeared to echo emotional moments once discussed only within the royal family. Old fears immediately resurfaced. If those memories could be revisited indirectly, what else might appear in future interviews, productions, or written accounts? Catherine reacted as she had throughout the conflict. Privately. She allegedly asked advisors whether any remaining information connected to her children, health, household, or private family relationships could still be exposed through future Sussex projects. She did not want a public battle. She wanted certainty that some boundaries remained untouched. William was far less restrained. Years earlier, he had reportedly urged caution to avoid making Meghan feel deliberately excluded. Now, his position had hardened. He demanded stronger protection around the Wales children, staff records, schedules, medical matters, and personal communications. Then, someone familiar with Catherine's original warning made a dangerous choice. This individual allegedly believed Catherine's reputation had been unfairly reduced to that of a cold, unwelcoming royal who resisted Meghan from the beginning. In their view, the public deserved to know that her caution had been based on concerns that later appeared disturbingly accurate. But correcting the record carried its own threat. Revealing the warning could expose palace strategy, confirm that internal restrictions existed, and hand Meghan evidence that decisions had been made without her knowledge. Senior officials divided sharply. Some believed the document would show Catherine as perceptive and protective. Others feared it would make her look prejudiced, as though she had decided Meghan was untrustworthy before the relationship had any chance to recover. From Meghan's position, the timing could seem brutally familiar. Each time she began rebuilding influence outside the monarchy, another palace-linked narrative appeared to question her character. Even without a direct royal attack in her latest project, critics could now claim it proved Catherine had been right all along. Harry reportedly felt cornered once again. He believed confidential records were being used not to reveal truth, but to weaken Meghan and frighten him away from future disclosures. Catherine, however, did not want vindication. She had wanted protection, not a public campaign celebrating that she had predicted the collapse. That was the tragedy. Catherine and Meghan were now trapped inside identities created by years of conflict, one silent and calculating, the other outspoken and destructive. The palace now faced its final choice: deny the warning, confront it, or allow silence to speak for them. The final decision would not be announced with anger or accusation, but its silence would carry a message more powerful than any palace statement Meghan and Harry had received before. There would be no public trial, no dramatic palace denial, and no direct confrontation between Meghan and Catherine. Instead, the monarchy allegedly chose its most devastating weapon: silence. Yet beneath that silence was a final decision that trust once broken could no longer be restored by apologies, appearances, or promises. The palace's refusal to comment was not surrender. It was strategy. By neither confirming nor denying Catherine's warning, officials allowed its meaning to spread without placing the institution directly behind it. The public could draw its own conclusions, while the monarchy remained protected by the distance of silence. But Catherine reportedly found no satisfaction in being seen as vindicated. If her fears had proved correct, the cost was devastating. Harry was estranged, William carried the grief of losing his brother, and relationships once believed unbreakable had collapsed beneath years of suspicion. Being right offered no victory when every future gathering would carry unresolved pain. For Meghan, the silence represented the same injustice she had always described. Palace insiders could influence the narrative through private briefings and preserved documents, while those at the center refused to answer direct questions. Once again, the institution appeared to control the story without accepting responsibility for its role in creating it. Harry faced the cruelest dilemma of all. To defend Meghan fully, he had to reject Catherine's warning as prejudice and manipulation. But to admit that even part of it had been accurate would mean questioning decisions that had changed his marriage, his family, and the direction of his entire life. William's position had hardened. Private access was no longer guaranteed by blood. It depended on trust. Family status could open ceremonial doors, but it could no longer provide entry into confidential conversations, sensitive planning, or the emotional center of the monarchy. The warning also changed palace life permanently. Important discussions became more formal. Personal exchanges were separated from official business. Words were documented, access restricted, and staff protected through procedures that made the institution safer, but colder. That was Catherine's warning in its most tragic form. It may have anticipated the danger, yet acting upon it helped create the atmosphere in which Meghan felt watched and excluded. From Meghan's perspective, public storytelling became the only weapon available against a system controlling hierarchy, access, and credibility. The true exposure was therefore larger than one woman being proven wrong. It revealed a family unable to separate private pain from institutional survival. Meghan was exposed again not through one confession, but through a document that seemed to predict the methods, conflict, and consequences that followed. And Catherine's warning may not be the only record preserved. Other objections, private responses, and buried documents could still exist, including Harry's reaction when he discovered how deeply William and Catherine feared the direction of his marriage. Behind the flawless public image remained the private cost: two brothers divided, two women trapped inside opposing stories, and a monarchy protected by silence but wounded by everything that silence failed to prevent. Because Catherine's warning may have finally emerged, but somewhere inside the palace archives, the response Harry never expected the world to see may still be waiting.